What's up, everyone? I'm Trey Baird. Let's walk and talk. What's going on, everyone? It's Cold Burn Horror Week here at Swollen Thumb Entertainment. We're celebrating all things Cold Burn Horror related this week, and I just wanted to touch on a few things today. The inspiration came to me the other day when I was talking about how horror movies that I grew up with, like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, were more slasher films, and that was kind of the common thing for a while. Whereas older horror films tended to be cold burn horror, and newer horror films tended to be cold burn horror. Just a quick refresher in case you hadn't watched them. Cold burn horror is typically when the intensity level ramps up throughout the film. The first or second act may not be that scary at all, but it builds up to a terrifying climax. Whereas slasher films tend to focus on body counts, tends to focus on blood and guts, and tends to have relatively the same amount of intensity throughout the entire film. It did get me thinking about something though, and that's what's better, modern horror or old horror? You know, new versus old school versus new school. In reality though, it's not really that simple because, you know, horror has had many eras. So it's more than just new versus old. It really depends on how you define new and how you define old. Let me kind of go down the rough list of eras. Keep in mind, I'm not an expert on this subject, so I can just give you a basic outline. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than what I'm going to go into, so feel free to do your own research on this subject. First, you have the classic era, where you have like the Universal monsters, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, etc., etc. You know, I personally am not a fan of this. I don't think they're really that scary, but you know, it's not really my thing. I respect the historical aspect, but entertainment-wise, they don't really do it for me that much. Technically, you can go back even further than that to films like Nosferatu, you know, silent films, but you know, we're not going to go that deep into the rabbit hole here. After that, you know, things are pretty quiet on the horror front up until you get into the era of like Night of the Living Dead, you know, the 60s and whatnot. This is when horror starts to more closely resemble what we're seeing nowadays. You know, where things can be legitimately terrifying and not everything has to be watered down. And this is when you start to enter an era of more intelligent horror. You start to get all of the genuinely creepy stuff like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, which I'm personally not a big fan of, but you know, Rosemary's Baby is often cited as being a good example of cold burn horror done right. And you have movies like the original Omen, and you have a lot of stuff like that. Lots of satanic themes, you know, things that generally cut to the core of what scared, genuinely terrified people as a society. This was an era where filmmaking was largely controlled by the artists themselves. And this goes across all genres of film, not just horror. So you can find all kinds of amazing films that were made in like the 60s and early to mid 70s. And then came George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who completely changed the way filmmaking is done in this country, and worldwide for that matter. One of them released a horror film, the other one did not. The horror film in question was Jaws, and it was a monumental blockbuster. It could be argued that it was the first summer blockbuster, and it created the formula that we are still trying to follow to this day, where the big corporations are controlling films and capitalism reigns over the artistic merit of the films themselves. The other film was Star Wars, and even though it's not a horror, it still had the effect on films that we're seeing to this day and age. So why am I talking about this? Well, it had an effect on the way horror was produced for a long time. Thus, when capitalism reigned supreme, we entered an era of slasher films, And these slasher films dominated the genre for so long. Like from the majority of the 80s through the majority of the 90s. Am I saying that that's the only thing that was produced during this time? Of course not. And the fact that I have to put a disclaimer like that just reflects on what kind of point we are when it comes to listening to people, where we are when it comes to creating a dialogue. I'm speaking generally here, not absolute. Only a Sith deals in absolute. And then something happened around the late 90s, towards the turn of the century. You know, something changed. We started to see a break from the repetitive nature of all the, mediocre slasher films, and we started to see a renaissance of unique horror. Maybe it was M. Night Shyamalan who broke the mold with his films. Condemn him all you want for his cliched tactics. If he's responsible for breaking the cycle and giving us something original in the horror genre, then I applaud him. So then we entered an era of more diversity in the horror genre. And even when we have a capitalistic, cliched series such as Saw, which is still technically a slasher series, at least as far as my definitions go, at least it's a little more original. The same old doesn't work anymore. You have to have something fresh and original to work nowadays. And nowadays, with all forms of entertainment, diversity is the big thing, and independents are starting to gain traction again versus the capitalistic corporations. So at this point, everything is becoming a niche market, and nothing is really mainstream anymore. So that's kind of where we are with horror too. A lot of independent horror is getting put out there, and the cream rises to the top. So like I said, there's no two categories regarding old and new. It really depends on where you draw the line. I mean, old to you might be, the Universal monster movies and the silent era of Nosferatu and maybe Metropolis, if you consider that to be a horror. Basically what I'm saying is nothing is black and white here, and it really is subjective. You really have to make a disclaimer before you even start to debate this subject. Now, with all of that said, where do I land on the subject? Well, I mean, I've said quite a bit already that I do tend to favor the slow burn, the more old school / new school approach to horror films. I'm not the biggest fan of slasher films, but I don't hate them. As a matter of fact, I do enjoy them kind of on an ironic level, in much the same way I enjoy infomercials. Like, I like them because they're cheesy. I like them because I'm not taking them seriously. Here's the thing though, as someone who has general empathy, I'm not a sociopath or a psychopath. I feel genuine emotion. I have the capability for mirror neurons. If you don't know what that is, look it up. If I'm watching horror, I want to take it seriously. Generally. I want to be scared. I want to feel that intensity. In my case, I don't get that from like the classic era of horror, the Wolfman, the Mummy, etc., etc. And I don't get that from Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees. Jump scares do nothing for me. They're next to pointless for me. I don't want to be laughing during a horror movie. Oh, ha ha ha, it's just a cat. Cats don't act like that in real life, by the way. I'll even take it a step further than that. I would go so bold as to pose the question, are slasher movies really horror? It seems almost that their intention is more to make people laugh than to scare people. And I'm not going to say flat out that that's my opinion, but I think it's an interesting talking point. Why is it that, the majority of slasher films follow this formula? They don't take themselves seriously. It's, they build tension, they release the tension. They build it, they release. They build it, they release. And then maybe, if you're lucky, in the third act, things will finally get a little bit unsettling. I can really appreciate a good horror film that steadily increases the tension. I mean, I would rather have a quote-unquote boring first act where nothing happens if they're going to at least build something instead of build and release, build and release, build and release. I mean, why do slasher films have to follow this formula? Why can't a slasher movie be tense throughout the film? Why does it always have to resort to comedy? It's a rhetorical question. I mean, I guess it's rhetorical. I already know the answer. It's because these are popcorn flicks. These were movies that you would take your date to, you know, and that's what sold. People didn't want to be legitimately scared. They just wanted that jump scene so that people could, you know, dates could cuddle next to each other and comfort each other. That's what sold. And it's like I said many times before, different strokes for different folks. You know, I'm not knocking anyone for enjoying what they enjoy. I'm just giving you my take on this. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good slasher film. Like, let me just go down the list real quick. I enjoy the original Friday the 13th. I enjoy part 4, the final chapter, which, as you know, was not really the final chapter. I enjoyed Freddy vs. Jason. I enjoyed the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I think it was Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4 I liked. Whichever one it was where the girl is pregnant. I think it was Part 4. I like almost all of the Saw films. So, and I'm sure there's more. You know, there was a few of the Halloween films, including the first one that I really liked. So, allow me to pose a final Jerry Springer-esque thought here. What is the best era of horror? Depends on how you look at it. Overall, we are living in the best era of horror. So, new school all the way, baby. But there is absolutely no denying that some of the best horror ever came from that era, pre-Jaws and post Night of the Living Dead, including Night of the Living Dead, which I think is a grossly underrated horror film. Everyone appreciates Night of the Living Dead, but how many people have actually seen it and appreciated it on an artistic level? So, as a whole, the modern era of horror is the best for its diversity and giving the power back to the indie studios. But there's no denying that there were definitely some diamonds in the rough in the 70s and early 80s, and late 60s to a lesser extent. So there's my answer. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you all later. Peace.